Thanks, Kim. A great pleasure to be here. Been a fascinating couple of days. And in some ways what I want to do is to come at a lot of the points that I think Lauren just made in that terrific presentation from a slightly different and perhaps in some ways slightly more pessimistic direction. The reason we're talking about the return of deterrence, of course, is that, I think, is that we face, and we know we face, some big new strategic challenges of a scale that we thought we weren't going to face in the post-Cold War world. And the challenge we face is how to make deterrence work against those big new challenges, and we have to remember a couple of things. One is, exactly as Lauren just said, that deterrence cuts two ways. That is, they deter us while we're deterring them, and we have to be very conscious of that. The other is that deterrence is never an end in itself. It goes back to the point that Steve was making. That deterrence is a means of achieving a policy objective. And we have to ask in the bit of best Clausewitzian tradition what it is we're trying to achieve through that strategic agenda. In thinking about that, I just want to focus on the two toughest cases, the really important cases, China and Russia, and think about how we are responding to them and what do we need to do to make deterrence work. And in the process, it's worth just being clear about not just who it is we're trying to deter, but what it is that we're trying to deter. What are we trying to deter them from doing? And I think that falls into a couple of categories. One is we want to deter them from undertaking a series of specific kinds of actions that we perceive they might be tempted to do. Perhaps in the European context, the most obvious one would be a serious attack on the Baltics by Russia. In the Asian context, there's a pretty wide range, but let's just focus on Taiwan and the Chinese pressure on Taiwan. But it's also worth bearing in mind that we're trying to do, in both cases, try to do something a bit broader than that. We're trying to deter both those countries from mounting what appears to be, in their different ways, sustained challenges within their own regions to the global order. That is, both of them in the long run seem determined to try and build a sphere of influence in their own regions which is incompatible with the model of global order that the West adopted at the end of the Cold War and that we still feel ourselves to be very committed to trying to sustain. And I think the core to understanding where we are now is to recognise that we have until very recently systematically underestimated how hard it's going to be to deter those two actors from the sorts of things I've just mentioned. Partly that's because we underestimated their motives. It has been very easy to believe for a long time that neither Russia nor China really wanted to change the global order because it worked so well for them and therefore wouldn't be dumb enough to do anything that threatened that order, because we couldn't see why they didn't think that the order was going to work just as well for them as it does for us. Well, it's a whole different story about why that happens to be the case, but we know it is not the case. They don't buy the present order, and they're serious about trying to resist it. That's one of the things the new national security strategy gets clearly right. But the second reason we've underestimated the attempt is because we've overestimated the credibility of our responses. We've overestimated how easy it is for us to deter them from those challenges and from actions that would manage those challenges. I think that's partly because we've assumed a greater preponderance in conventional capability than has been the case. I think we might call it the post-Desert Storm syndrome. We did a lot of drinking, if I may use an Australian expression, drinking our own bathwater after Desert Storm and believing what we thought we concluded from that, and that is that we can defeat any adversary, anytime, anywhere. And interesting question as to whether it's true. I don't think it is. I'll come back to that in a minute. But the main thing is they don't buy it. So they're less deterred than we expect them to be. And the second point is I think they're also less deterred than we expect them to be by our capacity to escalate to the nuclear level if we find the conventional levels not going our way. And what's more, I think there's a risk that in the US in particular, there's an underestimate as to the extent to which allies have also been reassured by those things. So I think extended nuclear deterrence is less robust than it can appear from Washington. It's easy to believe that the allies believed, that the adversary believed, that the United States would always be willing to do what it said it would do. And I think you'll find plenty of the allies are not as confident as that as you might think. So it's worth just saying, looking at in both of the key theatres, how those set of doubts plays out. And I stress that I spend a lot of time looking at Asia for reasons that will be obvious from my accent, much less time looking in Europe. One of the reasons why I found the last couple of days so interesting is to hear you all talking about that. But I think we have to recognise that we have, over the last few years, suffered a substantial, perhaps not complete, but a substantial deterrence failure in both theatres. I completely buy the argument that a number of people have made that it can be hard to tell whether deterrence has succeeded. But I don't think it's all necessarily that hard to tell when deterrence fails. When the other guy does something which we didn't want him to do and we thought we were going to succeed in deterring him from doing, and he goes ahead and does it anyway, no, that's deterrence failure. And so when the Chinese do the sorts of things they've done, and when Russia's done the sorts of things they've done, then we've failed to deter them. I think we need to be reasonably clear about that. And one might say, well, we've only failed in the grey zone. That is, we haven't really had to muscle up in a conflict. In either case, in both cases, the actions that the two countries have taken to prosecute their objectives against our wishes have been kept at the grey zone only. But that's because the grey zone's worked for them. They haven't had to escalate above the grey zone. And they seem to have judged, they've taken the risk of operating in the grey zone because they seem to have judged that we wouldn't risk escalating above the grey zone to conflict, so they could achieve what they wanted without risking a conflict, and they seem to have been right. There's also a clear risk that they'll think that they can escalate above the grey zone into, so to speak, real conflict in places like the Baltics or the Taiwan. They will use force, in other words, and believe they can get away with it because they believe we won't respond. They have learnt, perhaps mislearnt, but have learnt the lessons, drawn a lesson from the last few years, and I think Lauren's point about the red line in Syria is relevant there. So what do we do about it? If we're starting from behind, if as deterrence returns we find we've actually experienced a failure of deterrence, we have to ask ourselves, well, what do we have to do about it to do it better in future? Now, it's tempting, I think, to assume that the problem actually is not as bad as I've just said. That surely China and Russia must know that the US and its allies would respond to a military attack on the Baltics or a military attack on Taiwan. I very often hear that said. Well, I think we should be very careful about making that assumption, because I think there's a real chance that the danger we face is that they actually don't see it the way we do. And so if we're going to deter successfully, we need to be sure that they really believe that we would respond if they took those sorts of steps. And that is, I think, harder than it looks. And it's partly harder than it looks because at the conventional level, as I mentioned before, we have, I think, been complacent about our capacity to achieve our strategic objectives, our operational objectives, to achieve our strategic objectives in the relevant theatres with conventional forces. And that's partly because, I think, we have overestimated the value of the quality of our forces and underestimated the importance of geography and quantity. It was, after all, the Russian bloke who said quantity has a quality all its own. And when I look from a great distance and with no great expertise at what an escalating conflict between NATO and Russia over the Baltics looks like, I keep on being struck by how many advantages the Russians seem to me to have, even though unit for unit, I don't doubt their stuff isn't that flash. And I think that does raise some very interesting questions which were touched on by John Dunny's very interesting paper and discussion yesterday about the enhanced forward presence and the tripwire function in the Baltics. Because it does seem to me that deterrence there deterring Russia and the Baltics depends on the Russians believing that NATO has a credible concept to retake the Baltics if Russia overruns them, given that nobody believes the tripwire is actually going to stop the Russians before they get to the Baltic Sea, at least unless your battalions are even better than I think they are. Because this is, after all, battalions against divisions as far as I can see. And, of course, the tripwire increases the costs to NATO of not responding if the Russians move in, but it doesn't guarantee there's an effective response available. It might just guarantee that you end up paying that higher cost. And so I do think in order to make deterrence credible, conventional deterrence credible in Europe, NATO has to create and publicise, convey to the Russians a really credible concept of operations about how you retake the Baltics. And I don't know nearly enough about the theatre to have a view as to how you do that, but I'm just struck by how hard it looks. Once they've got it, then you're talking about a massive reinforcement. I mean, this is old, you know, for some of us of a certain age, this is familiar territory. A massive transatlantic reinforcement, a huge marshalling of assets in Europe. And of course, a very difficult kind of battle. In fact, it does start to look a bit like the old air-land battle. Who wins the battle to destroy everyone else's marshalling areas and all that sort of stuff. Now, I'm not saying it can't be done, but I would be surprised if the Russians believed that NATO really believes it has an answer to the question as to how it must be done. And if the Russians don't believe that, I don't think we can be at all confident that they're going to be deterred by the enhanced forward presence. Likewise, you could make the same point in Asia on the Taiwan case. This is a very big subject, of course, but there has been a fundamental change in the maritime balance in the Western Pacific in the last 20 years. A2AD is for real. It's very unclear to me how the United States can deploy and sustain sufficient combat power in the Taiwanese battle space to effectively give itself a good chance of achieving a successful outcome with conventional forces to defend Taiwan. And the SC battle was an attempt to create such a concept of operations, and I don't think it worked. And the third offset doesn't look to me like an operational concept, it looks to me like a vague hope. So unless the US and its allies, but don't rely on the rest of us, can create a really credible operational concept as to how you're going to win a conventional conflict against China over Taiwan, then you better not presume that the Chinese are going to believe that that's what you're going to do. And therefore don't believe the Chinese will be deterred. And of course what that makes us think is, well, this is not so different from the Cold War after all, because during the Cold War we were used to being in a position of conventional inferiority, at least in Europe. And what we relied on was nuclear first use. So that's what we have to fall back on. Well, the trouble is, goes back to the point about they can deter us, the trouble is that using nuclear weapons to offset our conventional deficiencies carries extraordinary costs and risks. Now, one of the real miracles of the Cold War was that for decade after decade, the United States persuaded everyone who mattered, the Russians or the Soviets and the Europeans and themselves, that they were willing to fight a nuclear war which would involve nuclear attack on the continental United States in order to save West Berlin. And it's a fascinating question as to whether they really would have, and it's a fascinating question as to whether they were right to, but the bottom line is that the wall was still there. The tanks never came west because everyone was convinced enough, in Dennis Healy's famous formula, to believe that wasn't going to happen. That the US really would fight that war. In other words, it was prepared to pay an astonishing price. And so the question, and it's not an original question, Xiong Guangkai asked it about Taiwan a couple of decades ago, is it credible that the United States would fight a nuclear war over the Baltics or over Taiwan, which involved direct attacks on the United States? And can Russia in Europe or China in Asia be deterred in the absence of a much more credible conventional option than I think we have, unless they're being convinced of that? And this, of course, is not a new problem. This is just, this is Thomas Schelling. This is, can we convince the other guy that Berlin is California? And in the Cold War, America did that, and it did it partly because it talked about it all the time. What convinced the Russians and what convinced the Germans and everyone in Europe that America was serious was that they could hear the Americans talk to themselves about it. And so they knew that the Americans themselves had had the conversation and convinced it. Now, I've never heard, since the end of the Cold War, a US leader make the argument that preserving Taiwan, for example, was worth a nuclear war with China in which the United States could be vulnerable to direct attacks on the homeland. And if that argument is not made explicitly, then it's very hard to win it. It's also, of course, very hard to convince allies. It's very hard to convince allies that you really will be willing to accept a nuclear attack on your territory, on American territory, in order to defend Japan or whoever, if they don't hear Americans saying this to themselves. And so there's a real question that's got to be asked. There is no doubt, I suppose there's no doubt, that there's some things in Asia and some things in Europe which are so important to the United States that it'll be worth fighting a nuclear war with China or Russia over. But is it Taiwan? And is it the Baltics? Well, both allies and adversaries need to hear what it is and why it is. And in particular, I think they need to hear the kind of arguments they heard in the Cold War, that is, that it's essential to the survival of America. Not essential to maintaining the old alliance structures, because we all love them, but essential to the survival of America. And maybe that argument's not there to be made. I'm not sure. In the end, that's an argument for Americans to have amongst themselves. For we allies, it's an argument for us to watch very closely. But if we don't hear it being made, we won't in the end trust America. So what do we need to do? The first one goes back to the point that Lauren made. We need to decide, but particularly the United States, needs to decide what we're willing to defend, recognising what it will cost us to do it, and build credible conventional options to do that, recognising that that may well require much, much bigger forces forward deployed than anyone's contemplating at the moment. Or, if we're not prepared to do it with conventional forces, explain how and why we're willing to do it with nuclear forces in a way that will really convince the adversaries. Now that does sound a little bit like a return to the Cold War, but of course it's not a return to the Cold War. The circumstances are different. Russia today is a very different adversary from the Soviet Union. China is a very different adversary from the Soviet Union. So we shouldn't think of this as a return to the Cold War. But what we should think of it is normal power politics as usual, as it has been through the millennia, but in the nuclear age. So this is power politics for the nuclear age, version 2.0. The Cold War was version 1.0. But it is a very different world. It's a world in which power is distributed very differently, in which ideology plays very differently. And so we're going to have to, one of the big mistakes we can make is to imagine that what we need to do with the return of deterrence is to try and use it to achieve the old strategic objectives. We need to work out what our strategic objectives should be in this very different world we're working in. And then work out what our strategic, how we should be using deterrence and other instruments of strategic policy to achieve an objective. Deterrence, as I said at the beginning, it's not an end in itself. It's a means to achieve a strategic goal, and we have to clarify that grand strategic goal right at the outset. And my hunch is, to leave you with this thought, it's not a matter of trying to preserve the old order, it's trying to imagine a new one. Thank you.